My name is Dr. Marina Joubert. I'm a science communication researcher and lecturer at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. I teach here a number of students at master's level. I've got a number of PhD students that I supervise, but I also offer a number of short courses and online courses in science communication. I think there's a perception that social media is dominating, but I think the past 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic showed us how important the mainstream mass media is and will always be, especially during a time of crisis. People want expertise, they want to listen to experts. And then the news mainly comes through mainstream media, online, television, print media, newspapers, etc. Radio, of course, very important in South Africa, and not only your commercial radio stations, but also your public stations and your community stations. And we really need to do more to get more good science content on those platforms. But of course, social media is not going to go away. It's where people reflect and comment and differ. It's more where the social conversations about science take place. When you think about public trust in science in a country like South Africa, you have to think a little bit about our history, where we came from. The fact that before '94, large parts of society were excluded from science. So we have a lot of catching up to do. We've got a lot of work to do to bring in more diverse audiences, people who may feel that science is not for them, or that they can't see a benefit or a relevance in their everyday lives. So that is a big focus at the moment, not only in South Africa, but specifically also here. How do we diversify audience? How do we engage with what you can maybe call under-reached audiences? How do we get young people interested in science? How do we have a debate and a dialogue with those who are affected or interested in a specific research project at community level? And so it's once again, it depends very much on a specific topic, and there's no sort of one-size-fits-all answer. It depends on, for every scientist, what are they working on, which communities are affected, who do they need to engage with, and you really need to tailor-make a science communication strategy for each and every research project if you want it to be effective. Scientists who work in controversial areas are typically a little bit more hesitant or ambivalent about whether they should or should not be in the public sphere. And like elsewhere in the world, it would be areas of genetic modification, maybe CRISPR technologies, technologies to do with anything to do with maybe embryos or stem cell research, that kind of thing. Those are the areas where the advances in science and the objective of science may come into conflict with some people's moral views and some other sensibilities and sensitivities. So, but once again, we've seen around the world that if the public opposes science sufficiently, it can actually stop science in its tracks. So the message for scientists from that is you don't really have a choice anymore. You have to engage. You have to get the public going along with you. The public pays for most of the research done in a country like South Africa, and if they don't approve, if you don't get public buy-in, if you don't get public support, that can really be detrimental to the research and even stop the research, through public opposition. So it's normally where there's a moral question or an ethical question, and that is why we encourage those scientists who work in controversial areas to not shy away from it, but to get help, to really think about it strategically, to really be careful, not just to go into the public arena unprepared, to think about their key messages, to think about what they want to achieve, but also to be willing to listen to the public, to listen to their concerns, to understand why they may be hesitant, and really respectfully engage in that dialogue. Because one of the things we've learned, and it's a hard lesson for scientists, is that science don't necessarily have all the answers. And these days we talk about different ways of knowing. There's indigenous knowledge systems, there's other ways of looking at things, and scientists have to understand that they don't have the only authority, and that they are one of many role players in society that must have a voice, but that must also listen to other voices. Living through the COVID-19 pandemic over the past 2 years, for many science communication researchers, and specifically, definitely for me, it was like living through a live global science communication experiment. It was actually, in a way, while I acknowledge all the negatives of the pandemic, of course, but purely looking at it academically, it was almost like a unique opportunity to really see science communication in action, to observe how publics respond, how scientists respond, how platforms change, how journalists respond. It was actually amazing. I mean, there has been a flood of research projects and new publications. And of course, here at Stellenbosch as well, we couldn't let this opportunity go by. So we did engage in a number of local and collaborative international projects, looking at various role players and actions. For me, going forward, the most important thing would be to ask, what can we learn from what we've observed? Because if we let this opportunity go to waste to learn some lessons, we have certainly, mistakes have been made, but I think there's also some lessons we can take away about how to build trust and how to avoid some of the confusion and misinformation and so on. So for me, that was the key thing. It happened, we were not prepared for it, but we know it may happen again, and therefore we have to be better prepared next time. About 5-7 years before the pandemic, I was already really interested in this topic of highly visible scientists. What makes some scientists become almost media superstars? What qualities do they have? How do they engage with the media? So that's actually a topic that I looked at before in earlier research. There was a Professor Ray Goodall in the United States already in 1975 that did a study at Stanford, her own PhD study called The Visible Scientists. And she looked at the scientists in the 70s who were really out there, really highly visible. And I found her PhD thesis read like a book, like a novel. You couldn't put it down. And so I copied some of her methods and wanted to find out at that time already, so this is long before the pandemic, who are the visible scientists in South Africa. And I used journalists to help me identify them. And we found at the time that only 1% of, actually a little bit less than 1%, about just more than 200 scientists in South Africa were identified as visible by South African science journalists. These were scientists that they could name, that they've interviewed before, that they knew about. So very, very small number, and that is concerning. And also, of course, most of them were white, most of them were male, so we clearly had some work to do to increase the number and to increase the diversity in terms of visible scientists. If you ask me why is it important, when scientists become visible in the mass media, they gain influence, they build their reputations. Importantly, they gain policy influence. It can really make a difference in their own careers and in the societal impact of their research. But it is important to have a balanced representation of scientists in the media. You don't want the same names again and again, and only men or only natural scientists. We need that diversity of voices. So during the pandemic, of course, we saw in a number of countries, including in South Africa, how one or two individuals really became almost science celebrities. And they were praised and loved by the public, and sometimes also hated and criticized by some parts of the public. And that is an inherent characteristic of high visibility. It has a lot of benefit, but of course there's also some risk that goes hand in hand with that high visibility. Now, in a study, we analyzed just more than 1,000 articles that appeared in the South African mass media in the first months of the pandemic, at the time when the news just broke and the media frenzy was really going wild in the first 5-6 months of 2020. And we found that Salim Abdool Karim really was the person, that became a household name and was widely quoted in the media. So Professor Salim Abdool Karim is well known for his HIV/AIDS research. He was well known in the South African media about 20 years ago already. He was one of the scientists who took on then President Thabo Mbeki about his AIDS denialism. So he was no stranger to the media, and he was appointed to lead one of the ministerial advisory committees, on COVID-19. So the media seized on this opportunity to interview him. But importantly, and this made, I think, all the difference, he was willing to engage. He made time for the media. He was willing to put, because it was a time of crisis, to put his own research on hold for a while. And he literally engaged in a flood of webinars and public talks and radio interviews and television interviews. I found him an interesting case study because of the way he communicated and the way journalists responded to him. And journalists often even wrote about him as a person. They became interested in the man behind the scientist. And that's one of the signals that somebody is achieving celebrity status. It's no longer just about the science anymore. They wanted to know about his family life. They wrote about his appearance. They wrote about his deep, beautiful voice, about his manner, the fact that he was able to take complex topics and, make it really simple. He told stories. He used metaphors to explain how the virus spread in communities. He really made the effort, and I think that made all the difference. A very, very important thing that he was able to achieve is that combination of credibility and warmth. If you can combine high credibility, being a top scientist, with showing some empathy, showing that you care, talking about your own fears and concerns, that really builds trust. I think, and this, what I say now, is based on other, peer-reviewed evidence. Credibility and warmth combined builds trust. Also, part of that was he acknowledged that mistakes were made. He didn't say, that scientists were always right. He said that we have to differ from one another. We have to debate, to move the issue forward. He talked a lot about the process of science, that it's inherently uncertain as new knowledge. So he helped people to understand why there would be a certain set of advice one day and then something different maybe 3 weeks later. So for him, it was really important for people to understand science as a process, the inherent uncertainties, and that it wasn't perfect. And then also importantly, in a number of interviews, he said that politicians must listen to scientists, but they mustn't listen only to scientists. They must also take economic and social realities into account. And so he acknowledged that it wasn't only about the science. So I think in many ways he showed us some of the ways to build trust, to create confidence, and also to really become the face that gives hope and that gives people reassurance and that gives people information at a time when they needed it most. Of course, I'm sure it was very, very taxing on him and time-consuming, and for a while his own research had to take a back seat. But during a time of crisis, that is what you need. And I think young scientists can learn a lot from analyzing and studying it, which I've done in a study, just specifically looking and analyzing at his communication style and his willingness to engage. If you think about, the regulations, the way they were announced and communicated in South Africa, certainly there were many mistakes made, but ultimately these announcements and regulations came from the politicians. They may have listened to the scientists, but they definitely, added their own ideas and their own perspectives. So, for example, if you think of a very basic regulation right at the start, stay at home. We were told to stay at home with very little notice. Now, if you live in a comfortable house with a well-stocked fridge and a pantry, and you have food and you have transport, and you were allowed to go out to the shops to buy essentials, and you could do that, you had enough money to carry you over 21 days or even a bit longer. That was one thing. But if you lived in an informal settlement with very limited access to extra food or sort of a buffer to carry you through this period, and you were not allowed to, say, trade, maybe you were an informal trader or something like that, I think the implications were so different. I think not enough attention was paid to how these regulations would affect different people in different societal settings. The scientists who get a high profile in the media definitely benefit from that. They get influence, they are heard, they attract funding, their reputations are enhanced, they get more collaborators, and they are the ones advising the public and also sort of shaping the debate. So it's very important that we must get a diversity of voices in there, that we should, for example, have male and female voices heard, because there will be different perspectives, black and white voices heard, different scientific disciplines heard. And we saw in our study that during the pandemic, 8 out of 10 of the most quoted professors were men, and more than half were from the natural sciences. So what we're saying is, that's, at least the social sciences were there, but they were very, very marginalized compared to the natural sciences, as well as, the female-male split. Of course, there are more male professors in South Africa than females, but in the media, this underrepresentation of women is even further aggravated. So we really feel it's important that institutions and scientists themselves and journalists should be aware of this and make an effort to create opportunities for women, to support them, and for black scientists and for social scientists to become more visible in the public domain, so that we can have a more nuanced and more balanced public debate about science and all its aspects and all its role players, and especially also the way that some scientists become role models for young people in society. Scientists are often scared of engaging with the media. They are worried about what their peers will say. They are worried that they will be misunderstood. They're worried that they will be wrongly quoted. My message to scientists who say they don't have time would be, can you afford not to do it? You are working with public money. If you keep quiet, if you're not there, if you're not part of the debate in the mainstream media as well as on social media, then the only voices that will be heard will be those who peddle misinformation and those with different agendas. So instead of thinking about, can I afford the time, I would rather say, can I afford not to be there? Maybe there's different niches for different scientists, and I also always advise young scientists to find what works best for them. Some are really good at live interviews, on camera. Some are better at writing popular articles. There are many ways to engage. You don't necessarily have to go on a stage, on a public stage, but please become part of the conversation because you owe a moral duty to society. But also, importantly, because you as a scientist and your career can benefit from it. This is, for me, the most interesting aspect of all the research, including my own, done on this topic, is how scientists report that they go into public engagement or a media interview thinking that they're giving something back to society, but afterwards they actually realize that they got a lot out of it too. They got new perspectives. They heard interesting questions from the public. The public conversation gave them new ideas for future research. They now understand why people feel a certain way in a way that they never did before. So that kind of benefit you can only experience once you do it, once you put your foot in the water. And like with everything else, you get better over time. It can be scary, it can be quite risky at some stage, but if you prepare and if you think about what you're doing and if you also have respect for the audience and the journalists and their role, it can actually be a very rewarding and satisfying part of being a scientist. So if young scientists are keen to get into science communication and play a bigger role in science and public engagement, there are a few general things I would advise. The first thing is think about communication as an integral part of your research, not as an afterthought that you do, after you've published your article. And this means plan for it when you plan the research and budget for it when you budget for the research. That will enable you to get some help, because you don't have to do it all on your own. You can get help from an artist, from a filmmaker, from a videographer, from a writer, from an editor. It's really important that scientists shouldn't think they should, do it all on their own and they should master all these other skills over and above, being a good researcher as well. And then I would say, if you specifically want to engage with the mass media remains such an important part of the science communication ecosystem. You have to become a media consumer yourself. Get to know community newspapers, community radio stations in the area where you live. Buy some national newspapers and some weekly papers. Listen to different stations, watch different stations on television, and get to know the journalists. Write down the names of the journalists who report on science, and specifically if you like their style and if they report, write or speak about things that are close to your own field. Because those are the journalists that you need to build relationships with, that you need to reach out to. Get help inside your own organization. If you're in a university or a science council, go and meet the media people. Find out who they are, find out what they can offer you. They may have some platforms and opportunities and science cafes, and for example, writing, they can help you to write for The Conversation, which is a platform that can give you a lot of media exposure. So there's a lot of help available. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. Look at what is already in place. And then I would also say, don't go into a media interview unprepared. Don't think it's just, I know my stuff and I don't need to prepare for this. Find out about the audience, find out about the platform. Think about the most important things that you really, really need to get across, or that you would love to get across in a specific interview. But importantly, also, put yourself in the shoes of the audience and ask yourself, if I were listening to Cape Talk this morning, for example, what would I want to know about this topic? If the topic is about fire or the topic is about water scarcity, whatever, what is it likely that the people in the public would want to know about, or the audience of this specific platform? And then see if your messages that you want to get across and what they are most likely to want to hear, how they match and how you can bring them together. So it's about preparation, it's about planning, it's about integrating it into your research, keeping track of what you do. Because if you can achieve success with media engagement and with public communication, you can write up those things when next you apply for a research grant, and that will count in your favor. Increasingly, funders are asking for evidence of societal impact, so it can really, really make a big difference in your career, and ultimately you will find those benefits and you will find it rewarding.